Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History. Today, we're going to continue on the road to the Civil War, and in particular, we're going to talk about this idea of popular sovereignty towards deciding on the issue of free state versus slave state. And in particular, we're going to get into the violence that erupts from this. So the image that we're looking at is a perfect example of this. We're going to be kind of concluding today with Bleeding Kansas, which is what ends up kind of becoming an internal civil war within the state of Kansas itself, because the people of Kansas are going to get to decide whether they're going to be a free state or a slave state. And the figure, of course, that you see here is John Brown, who is a radical abolitionist who believed in many ways that he was chosen by God to lead these efforts in Kansas. And we'll talk more about him in just a moment. As far as our learning target, we're going to be able to explain how popular sovereignty is going to lead to violence in Kansas. Now, to recap a little bit, we talked a little bit about part of the Compromise of 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Act. And again, this was part of that compromise with California becoming a free state and more popular sovereignty, this idea of people choosing things in like Utah and Nevada, and Utah and New Mexico. I misspoke there. But it does require all citizens, including those in the North, where slavery was, or where they were free states, to help catch runaway slaves. So anyone who aided a fugitive slave could be fined or could be imprisoned. And so it was this attempt at trying to undercut slaves escaping through means like the Underground Railroad. So after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, many of your southern slave states, especially slave owners, they tried to step up their efforts at trying to stop this movement of escaped slaves. And so they tried to step up the efforts to capture slaves along the way as they made their way north via the rail system of the Underground Railroad, via the network of safe houses, in attempts to try to stop them from getting to the north. One of our other main ideas, we're going to talk about the Kansas Nebraska Act here, resulted from another dispute over slavery in Congress. So Kansas and Nebraska are both going to become states, and under the Missouri Compromise, they would be becoming free states because they are both north of that 3630 north latitude line, meaning again that they should be free states. And that they should be admitted so as part of joining the Union. But pro-slave states, especially those in the South, are not going to be big fans of this. So in 1854, the Kansas Nebraska Act gets passed. And it's going to repeal the Missouri Compromise because they didn't like the idea that it limited the spread of slave states. And so it allowed for popular sovereignty instead to decide the issue of slavery. So just to review, popular sovereignty, that's the theory that government is the subject to the will of the people. So in other words, people should get to vote on whether they become a free state or a slave state in Kansas and Nebraska. And that's what's going to happen. The problem is that you're going to have both slave states and free states try to rig things in their favor. And that's going to lead to violence. So that's kind of where we're heading. So in Kansas, a pro-slavery legislature was elected because a group of border ruffians, and these are Missourians, who traveled in armed groups to go and vote in Kansas's elections during the mid 1850s. And they traveled from Missouri and then went to go vote in Kansas as part of the new state. Anti-slavery groups formed their own governments, and so what you're going to see is there's going to be an outbreak of violence, and it's going to become pretty inevitable, and you're going to see essentially an internal civil war within the state of Kansas erupt, and that's going to lead to violence. Now, here's where enters in John Brown. John Brown is going to lead some anti-slavery forces in retaliation against this pro-slavery attacks in Lawrence. So a younger John Brown on the left, an older John Brown on the right. So who is John Brown and what do we know about him? So let's get a little bit of background on John Brown. Brown believed that God had chosen him to put an end to slavery, and that it was his role to take violent measures in order to ensure the end of slavery. He's also going to lead an attack on some pro-slavery men at Potawatomi Creek in Kansas. And that's going to lead to the events of Bleeding Kansas, in which hundreds of people are going to be killed. And in some ways, these actions, in some ways, forecast where we're heading. In some ways, they foreshadow what's going to be occurring later on in the country. So this idea of popular sovereignty, in some ways, it didn't work. It only led to more violence because both sides tried to make it work in their favor, and neither one would accept the results of the vote because the vote was inaccurate. And so that kind of is where we're going to wrap up for today. So thinking about what was the main cause of the Civil War in Kansas, options include a dual government set up by pro and anti-slavery groups, the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, John Brown's attack on the Potawatomi Creek, or the invasion of Kansas by border ruffians. So, a little bit difficult question, but looking for the main reason. That's going to be A. The refusal of both groups to accept the results because of people coming in to vote, particularly those border ruffians. The passing of the Fugitive Slave Act here is important and certainly leads to some tensions. But it's the idea of popular sovereignty that perhaps is more important here. John Brown's attack on the Potawatomi Creek is actually a response to those governments being formed, and then the invasion of Kansas by the border ruffians leads to some tension. But the main reason is that these two have split. So another example of how one of the strategies towards defining slavery through popular sovereignty, it doesn't work. And so this section gets us closer to that Civil War. And so we're going to talk about some of these other events like the Dred Scott decision coming up, and it's going to get us closer and closer to the Civil War. So for my students, thank you for listening. For those of you who are listening for fun, thank you. And I hope in some ways we've increased your understanding on how this idea of popular sovereignty to try to figure out the issue of slavery doesn't work. And so we're going to wrap up here for this edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History. Have a great day, and thank you very much.